maybe I should just explain a bit of the background in this research that I've been doing. Okay, I've been involved at the University of the Free State in South Africa for 30 years, teaching in education as well as teaching in the business school. As a matter of fact, I'm still an associate to the university, but then a private distance education company and in South Africa, which is the largest distance education provider in South Africa, asked me to come and work for them, so I've been there for 2 years. But being an academic, you're always involved in research. So what happened here is that in this distance education company, I identified I was worried about the quality of learning in a distance mode, and decided how can we better improve that kind of quality of learning and to give more support to the learning process, and that is actually how this research originated. Now, I'm going to look at the research problem, some theoretical framework, because I'm using the interaction equivalency theorem. I'm also looking at scalability, research design, some analysis, a conclusion, and a framework that I suggest, and then some significance of the research. Now, if we have a look at the context of distance education, we know that in terms of the global development goals, education has to optimize all avenues to improve the kind of education that is given. Now, of course, distance education is accessible, it's more affordable, it's got different modes of presentation, which became quite an favored mode in a number of countries, especially in the higher education sector. And if we think about the MOOCs in America, where that is really a massive expansion of how education is taking place. However, in the basic education sector, that is now the schooling phase, a number of countries have got it highly developed. Like in Indonesia, it's part of the National Department of Education. Also in China, Mexico, Pakistan, Brazil, and a number of other countries. In South Africa, that's not the case. In South Africa, it is vested in the private sector. It's acknowledged by legislation, but it's in the private sector. There are no parts of the national education system that actually provides for distance education. Now, I'm from Impak, which is the largest of the private providers of distance education. We've got about 13,000 learners in South Africa at the moment. Now, the problem is when it comes to learning support. Learning support is very necessary because it enhances the quality of our learning. It is affordable, but it has to be scalable, and we have to think about it because it's in the private sector, it has to make business sense. So however, whatever we do to provide that kind of support, it has to make sense. And so in this case, where I looked at the literature that exists on distance education, it's quite, there's a lack of really on learning support on distance education. A lot on distance education, not much on learning support. However, those that I have found was on higher education. I couldn't find anything on learning support in the basic education sector. Well, I would rather say there are limited research, because maybe there are research that I couldn't find. In the South African context, there's none. So this is actually a new part of the research that we are doing. So what I came across was an interaction equivalency theorem of Anderson and Garrison, and which actually originated in the higher education framework. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that and look at that theory and build on the theory and see whether it could be a viable theory for distance education in the basic education phase as well. Now, of course, we are part of this private providers, in particular in the South African context. Now, what is my problem question? How can distance education learners best be supported to optimize that learning in ways that not only optimize the learning, but also that makes business sense? So the purpose is to provide a framework for that learning, and I'm going to use the interaction equivalency theorem. Now this is more or less what the theorem is about. Now it actually originated 100 years ago with Dewey, that said there must be a lot of interaction going on when learning takes place. And this model was more or less also then later refined by Sims and also by Moore, which extended the fact that there are three components in these interactions when learning takes place. And the one is facilitator, which I actually changed to facilitation because we're working in a distance education mode. Facilitator, learner, and content. And those are the things. And you could either have, you should have those two to be effective, you should have those two, and you should have those to make it effective. Now what do we do in a distance education condition where we actually don't have a direct face-to-face contact with a facilitator, neither do we have face-to-face contacts with some other learners as well. So then Anderson came, and Anderson and Garrison developed the model, which they call the interaction equivalency theorem, and there I tried to set it out in a more simplified manner that say, if any two or one is of very high quality, you can eliminate the others. The other could either be reduced, or you could only have one or two of them, and you don't have to have all three of those modes of interaction when theory takes place. So it means that, for instance, if you have learner, facilitator, and or learner content that are of very good quality, it will be equivalent to all the other modes. That's more or less what this theorem tells us. Now, if we have a look, and I want to apply that in a context of which particularly we want to see how it works in a private sector institution or in a sector that distance education has to be provided. We also have to look and see what it is in a scalable and something that makes business sense. So to be scalable, I think that was a very good explanation. Developing products or services that people want and figuring out how to produce many of them for lower cost while selling more of them. That's more or less what scalability is about. So when an institution or a private institution business has to look at that, they have to think forward. They can't lose the core elements of what the business is doing. They have to know the market, and they're not allowed to forfeit any quality. So those were the background factors that I had to account for in looking at this research. So what I did here, I actually used design-based research because I had a theory that I wanted to work on. And the theory here was the interaction equivalency theory that I explained to you now. The context of that theory, and that theorem particularly, was distance education and as it is provided in a private sector conditions. Then, as part of that design, I used a sequential explanatory mixed methods approach. And first of all, I did some quantitative analysis, and I gathered some qualitative data. In the quantitative data, I went to all our people that are working on face-to-face with our clients, our subject advisors. We looked at our client-facing support groups, and I asked them, what are the kind of questions that you get? What are the things that people have problems in when they engage in this kind of learning in which we provide? So from that, I then developed 25 questions and identifying areas that I seem to be and possible options how that could be adapted. And I used SurveyMonkey. I've sent it out to 100 randomly selected learners and facilitators. Now we've got facilitators, and that could be either parents, it could be tutors. They're all on our system. And I got a 68% response. It means 68 of them answered me, of which 27 were learners and 41 were facilitators. I used a 5-point Likert scale. After that, I identified 10 open-ended questions, and I went to 25 grade 10 to 11 well-performing learners on our systems, and I asked them, how would you like to elaborate on your needs in that particular area? And 14 of them participated in the questions in the end. So 25 of them, but I'm only going to work on the 10 with the highest ranking. Now, what we are doing here is, what we found is that the highest ranked one, what they wanted, enriched content, enrichment. And you can see the mean scores of the whole entire group, of the learners, of the facilitators, and then our p-values as well. Then a tutor that is available online. They wanted a virtual tutor, independent learning, so they still wanted the work to be done in a way that they can do independent learning. They wanted other kind of advice, like examinations on questions that they have on subject choices and the way after school. They want education specialists to be available, online lessons, day-to-day guidance, and some virtual tutoring as well. When I went to the qualitative research, and I've just put on in red some of the answers that I got, was that they wanted to study at night and during weekends. So where we as a company have only limited office hours, they would like to extend it to after hours as well. They want to get somebody that is immediately available when they get stuck. They want to have their content to be alive. They need other kinds of advice. They wanted online presentations, and they asked about things like, younger people, smartphone and tablet apps, step-by-step guidance, and on a computer, and some of the aspects in examinations and where assessment is of value. Now, if I look at this, look at the entire thing and how this conclusion comes on, what happened here is when I used the theory, which is particular the interaction equivalency theory, I then identified that content and facilitation were the biggest, where the areas were ranked the highest. Now, what do distance education providers have to look for? They have to see which are the areas that need to be outsourced, delivered online, or provided in-house. So those are the kind of things that makes business sense. They have to look at how they can budget for the initial financial layout. So, of course, that is an aspect to look at. What are the numbers of learners that will be dealt with properly? How can they calculate the savings on staff cost if they do it in another way? They also have to acknowledge the differences in the needs between the learners and the needs of facilitators in particularly, and how to integrate these findings into current offerings, as also then, of course, we have to monitor the effect of that over a period of time. So what the idea was to actually develop our own theorem, and coming from that, and which I used in this way, where I thought learners always remain the centerpiece of any kind of framework when it comes to learning. I identified the facilitation and the content part, which is then identified there, and then the third part is more personal advice and guidelines that learners actually need. And as I said, there are ways of offering it, outsourcing it, becoming technologically driven, or in-house. And those that I did in italics are more those that can also be done technologically driven. They want advice on examinations, on career choices, step-by-step guidance for the year's work, and then subject specialists that must be available. And that was particularly, when I looked at this, the last part you'll see there where there were significant differences in the ways that the facilitators and the learners had different ideas of what they thought was important for them. And when we look at the facilitation part, they have to have a tutor platform, for instance, for available online any time of the day after hours. Detailed facilitation guide so the facilitators can follow it. Clarification of difficult concepts, that could be done either online, in hard copy, virtual tutoring, online lessons. Those are the kind of things that is part of the facilitation, because there is no constant facilitator like a teacher. From about the content, enriched content, allowing for independent learning, and of course aspects like mobile and tablet apps that learners can use to work on the learning process. Now, if this is what we're going to do, I had to look at the significance of this kind of research. First of all, I believe that it makes a theoretical contribution. There was particularly a gap in how do we support learning in a basic education phase, and particularly in our country. There's limited research on that in distance education, on that. We also lack any research on this in South Africa, maybe globally, which I couldn't find, but maybe there are. And also we extend the body of knowledge on the interaction equivalency theorem, which was actually developed for the higher education sector, and now we've got another extension that we could use on the basic education phase as well. It's got a practical and business contribution, so it developed a scalable system for the private sector, and then of course it also can enhance education. It's accessible, it could improve some results, it could improve quality, and at the end it also helps and contributes to the realization of our global development goals in this way, while we reach every learner that is out there. Thank you, and this is for my references.